Welcome back to part 2 of chapter 29 on plant diversity, part 1. So let's look at some details of the three phyla of bryophytes because we ended the part 1 with talking about how the moss life cycle works and some of the facts about how plants have acquire these adaptations to live on land. So that's why we started talking about the first group of plants in the plant lineage from the algae, which was the non-vascular plants called bryophytes. So first, there's liverworts from the phylum Hepatophyta. So this called the common name liverworts actually refer to its liver-shaped gametophyte, which is kind of interesting, right? And this particular species of liverwort is called Marchantia. Okay, and Marchantia have these interesting liver-shaped gametophytes. And during medieval times, those people actually thought their shape indicated that this plant can help treat liver disease. Hence, that's why, even in the scientific name, it was called hepato phyta. Hepato usually for anatomical terms means something to do with the liver. So I guess they thought, okay, it looks like a liver, so maybe it's used to help treat liver disease. Of course, that is untrue. And then so their gametangia are usually elevated on stalks like this and look like little mini trees sitting on top of their sporangia. So, excuse me, the gametophytes. So bottom here are all the gametophytes. Here's their sporangia up here. That's why they look like these little trees. And then their sporophytes are tiny with short seta that is almost, really hard to tell by eye that there is actually seta, which is only under the light microscope you can see a very tiny seta followed by a foot, which connects to the gametophyte for nutrients and water. But all of this, kind of is embedded within an oval capsule for these little palm tree looking things on top of the liverwort, in this case, the Merchantia. Now, Plagioscilla is another type of liverwort that is more leafy type of gametophytes. It has more leafy type of gametophyte because before when we were looking at liverworts, there's some leaf things around, but remember they're more filamentous shape that we talked about for moss, but for this particular Plagioscilla, they look very interesting with all these more leafy bottom parts or gametophytes. Okay, so now the second type of bryophyte we can talk about is the hornworts, which falls under the phylum Anthocerophyta. Okay, they refer to a long taper shape of the spirophyte. So their spirophyte are not like little trees sitting on the top; they're like little horns sitting on the top. That's why they're called hornworts. And its spirophytes actually lack seta. There's no seta at all, and it consists only of a sporangium. And how the sporangium release their mature spores are also slightly different compared with the peristome we talked about. They actually split open from the very tip of the horn, and then the spores will burst out. Frequently, first species for hornworts, they're usually the first species to colonize open area with any moist soil of any sorts, which is why I say you will find them somewhere on Earth, just walking around because of the fact that they can easily colonize an open area. And why they like those moist soil and they can so easily colonize in open areas because they actually have a symbiotic relationship, which means that they are benefiting each other, that type of relationship, with nitrogen fixing cyanobacteria. All right, so mosses are the third type of bryophyte we'll talk about in this chapter. Mosses fall under the phylum Bryophyta, just like bryophytes. So mosses is usually seen as a carpet, a whole green carpet looking thing, consisting mainly of gametophytes. And their leaves usually are blade looking, kind of like these right here. And rather than stalks like this, they usually are one cell thick. Where if you have ever seen like moss on top of a rock, you can tell that is not very thick. More complex leaves that have ridges coated with cuticle can actually be found on common what's called hairy cat moss, which is then this picture right here, called polytricium. Okay. And spirophytes are usually elongated, and like we talked about earlier, they're usually green when they're young, so they are photosynthetic. And then as they mature, they will turn to this tan, brownish red color to signify that it has matured, and they will be ready to release the spores out. So be sure to be able to identify these different plant species by these pictures here, in addition to knowing all the information about each of them when studying for the exam, because pictures will definitely again be on lecture exam 2, and likely will be these type of identification for plant diversity chapters. Okay. So finally, we will discuss the ecological and economic importance of mosses. First of all, the wind dispersal of lightweight spores have actually spread mosses all around the world. Again, going back to what I said earlier, we can see mosses everywhere, wherever you live in. They are usually common and diverse in any moist forests and wetlands. Some actually can colonize bare, sandy soil. There are different mosses, so they can colonize different area. And then these mosses, being in these bare, sandy soil, can actually retain nitrogen in the soil, help retain that. And some harbor actually nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria. And again, they will help the ecosystem by increasing the nitrogen content if it doesn't have enough in that particular ecosystem. Some mosses actually inhabit mountaintops, inhabit mountaintops, tundra or deserts, very extreme environments. And why they're able to survive in such extreme environments is because they are able to survive loss of most of their water. This is not something that any plant can do. Some plants, once they lose their water, they're dead. But for a lot of mosses, they can lose a majority of their water. And then when they become they're able to have access to moisture again, they can actually rehydrate themselves as soon as that moisture is available. So that is a feature that moss have compared to other plants. I mean, kind of like my household plants, if they're losing water because I didn't water them for months or something, or neglected them, and then I soak them in water, they're not gonna revive itself. Once after a certain amount of time of drying out, that plant is dead for good. So this is something moss can have special ability to do. And last but not least, phenolic compounds are actually found in moss cell walls, and they have been shown that they can absorb damaging levels of UV radiation that is present in the deserts or high altitudes. So it's nice that these mosses are living in those mountaintops, those tundra and deserts where UV radiation can be abundant, because there's nothing much to block those UV radiation, those areas. There's no skyscrapers in those really bare areas. So it's nice to have those moss there to help absorb those UV radiation. So a specific type of moss called sphagnum moss, or also known as peat moss, is a major component of deposits of partially decayed organic material known as peat. And because of phenolic compounds in its cell wall that we just talked about earlier with moss, because this is still a moss, a sphagnum moss, a specific type of moss, but they still have that phenolic compound inside its cell wall. But because it has that, sphagnum moss actually don't decay very readily. On top of that, you're talking about they're in areas where there's low temperature, low pH, low oxygen levels. These are where, areas where there's a lot of sphagnum moss layers, thick layers of them, so thick that we just pretty much call these peat lands because they're filled with peat. And within these peatland, they say is because of the fact that they don't decay readily. They also inhibit decay of other organisms that's embedded within it. So they say, interestingly, sometimes peatlands will preserve corpses, like human corpses or animal corpses for that matter, for thousands of years. So they actually have found mummified people kind of embedded into the peatland because of the fact that the peat prevented that corpse from decaying, so that they preserve a lot of its, structure. Okay, so on top of that, peat is also a fuel source for the longest time in Europe and Asia. And then now recently, they're also a fuel source in Ireland and Canada. Now, peatlands cover only about 3% of the Earth's land, but those 3% of these peatlands can contain a third of the world's soil carbon. I think they were talking about in terms of billion tons of carbon that our peat is harboring. So this is something we want to preserve and something we want to keep around, because they're very useful for both our environment ecology wise and also our economic means. But uh, now, because of the fact that peat moss stores so much carbon, and is so valuable, there's actually over harvesting of it. These over harvesting of sphagnum actually contributes to global warming because they release those stored carbon dioxide. Because we just said that peats actually contains 1/3 of the world's soil carbon, which means that when they are burned for fuel, they are releasing those carbon off as CO2. And the more CO2 we release into our environment, that can contribute to global warming. Now, when we have global warming, we usually have what's called climate change, where weather gets hotter and hotter each year. So these global temperature will increase when we have global warming, and actually causes the water levels of the peatlands to drop, because these are supposed to be very wet areas. And because it's hotter than usual, the water levels drop, and this actually exposes the peat to air more often than they should. The peat starts decomposing once it's exposed to air, because the fact that it won't decay much is because it's within those wet areas. So the peat decomposes, and then they will release additional source CO2, because as the peat decompose, they will release their carbon in forms of carbon dioxide. And that leads to even more carbon dioxide being released into the environment and worsen the effects of global warming, which makes it worse. So, hence, the historical and expected future effects of sphagnum moss on the global climate really highlights the importance that we need to preserve and manage these peatlands. Global warming affects the entire world, even though you're like, well, it's not really affecting me as an individual. It will eventually catch up to affecting the weather. Once you affect the weather, then it causes more natural disaster, more floods, more hurricanes, more tornadoes. And then you have also affected agriculture, where, fruits are not ripening at the right time, and they're not at their best quality, etc., because of the weather, or they ripen faster and they're decaying faster, spoiling faster, etc. So global warming has a whole worldwide effect in all aspects. So we need to do our best to minimize this increase in climate change that we've been contributing to global warming. We need to stop and minimize that contribution of releasing carbon into the air. So now moving on to the next category of plants, which are the seedless vascular plants. We're almost close to the end of the chapter, okay, so trust me. So they are represented by two phyla, which is the phylum Lycophyta, and which are commonly known as Lycophytes. And then the second is phylum Monilophyta, which is commonly known as Monilophytes. Contrary to bryophytes, ancient relatives of vascular plants have branched sporophytes that's not dependent on gametophytes for nutrition. because we said earlier that bryophytes, sporophytes, have to be attached to the gametophytes with a little foot in order to get nutrients from it. They cannot be detached. Well, for vascular, seedless vascular plants, that's actually the opposite. Okay? Sporophytes are not dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition. So the branching of these vascular, plants, sporophytes, allows for more complex and also carry multiple sporangia at the top like that. As you can see in this reconstructed seedless vascular plant, we know how that's approximately how it looks like due to fossil records that show us that it exhibits dichotomous branching with sporangia at the ends of its branches. And from this fossil, they're even able to see a fossilized stoma, which is pretty cool. See how it has that outline of the little lip opening we talked about earlier with the stomata. So they can see that in fossils too. So those same openings for gas exchange we talked about in plants in their adaptation for land, we see that in this fossil, which is pretty cool. Hence, the life cycle for seedless vascular plants is dominated by sporophytes instead of gametophytes that you saw in non-vascular plants. It is sporophyte at this time around that are larger and more complex, while gametophytes are actually tiny and they either grow on top of the land, the soil, or just below the soil surface by a little bit. So let's see. So in addition, vascular plants have two types of vascular tissue that is absent in bryophytes that we didn't talk about. So these are all the little features that vascular plants have that non-vascular plants don't have. One is called xylem. Xylem is what conducts most of the water and minerals, and from the soil into the plant. Throughout the entire plant is what conducts water and minerals. It is the xylem. And inside they include what's called tracheids, okay? And these tracheids are actually tube-shaped cells for carrying water and minerals up from the roots. So here is a plant right here with roots into the soil, and in order for the plant to absorb any water and minerals around the soil into itself, it needs the xylem and distribute it throughout the plant itself. So these water conducting cells usually are dead at maturity when we're talking about those that make up your xylem. And then their cell walls are actually strengthened by a polymer called lignin. So there is a process called lignination that allows for, strengthening of the xylem even though the cells are dead. It's kind of like our skin cells that are at the very top surface are dead cells. Same thing here. You have these xylem that are really dead cells. The other is called phloem. Phloem has cells arranged into tubes that distribute sugars, amino acids, and all other organic materials. So this is how phloem differs from xylem. Xylem is only for water and minerals, whereas phloem, it is for those bulkier things like sugar, amino acids, and other organic materials. And on the contrary to xylem, these cells are alive at maturity. None of them are dead. And here is a picture that compares between the two vascular tissues. I guess it's kind of like us having veins versus arteries and capillaries. In plants, they have xylem versus phloem. So they differ in their structure when you look at xylem versus phloem because of the different things they transport. For xylem, it is a one-way flow for water and minerals only. There's no end walls between cells, and then it is strengthened from lignin. Okay, phloem, on the other hand, is a two-way flow type of vessel, and it is for food and water. And then the end walls have holes in them, perforations. That's why they allow for the bulkier things to go through. So here are the other features that set vascular plants apart from non-vascular plants. Uh, One of the first of those are lignified vascular tissue that we just talked about that gives xylem their strength. So this is what also allowed for vascular plants to grow very tall. Stems actually became very strong because of this lignins, and that support a lot of height against gravity. Because that was a whole problem we talked about and challenge we talked about earlier is, how our algae is gonna adapt it to life on land because when they're so weak and soft. And hence, this lignin with vascular plants really gives them that strength to get higher and higher above ground. And they can also transport water and minerals and nutrients higher and higher above ground because of these lignified vascular tissue. If it was soft vascular tissue, that tree will bend downwards. So that's why you have these lignin to really make it stand up straight and tall. So there are many benefits of being tall. I mean, when we talk about humans, we have those benefits, but for plants and trees, they have very, benefits of being tall too. First, they outcompete short plants for access to sunlight, which sunlight is a very important ingredient in photosynthesis. It is through photosynthesis that plants are able to provide food for themselves. That's why you don't need to feed plants food because they can, just from sunlight and carbon dioxide alone, make glucose through photosynthesis. Okay, so being tall actually reaches for as much as sunlight as possible at the top. It's kind of like, you're at the concert. If you're short, it's hard to see over the crowd, whereas a tall person can see very clearly above the crowd. Similar concept here. Second is that spores can actually disperse farther than short plants when we're talking about tall tree versus a short shrub. So the fact that the spores can be thrown farther than short plants, this is what allows for rapid colonization as well. So it is the competition amongst vascular plants that led to selection for even taller growth forms. Eventually, this selection gave rise to trees, and with trees, more and more trees growing taller and taller, you have the evolution of the first forest about 385 million years ago. So that's how the first forest came into play, is through these seedless vascular plants that has these lignified tissue that got taller and taller and taller as selection goes. And then they have, not that they become taller, remember, it's a variation of different heights, but it selects for the tall height trees, and that's how they become a forest. All right, roots was another thing that has evolved in sporophytes for absorption of water and nutrients from soil. Okay, and again, this is different from rhizoids that we talked about. Rhizoids don't do absorption of water and nutrients, but roots do. And on top of that, they allow for even stronger anchoring to the ground. Because these roots can branch out in very complex structures, and that way it allows for stronger anchor, and you can have a taller shoot system. That's why the trees or plants can get taller and taller. All right. The next thing that seedless vascular plants have that is different from non-vascular plants are leaves. Leaves serves as the primary photosynthetic organ for vascular plants. This is where the only place where photosynthesis can happen, with a few exceptions. There are plants where the stem is actually the photosynthetic source, but for most plants in general, the leaves are the primary photosynthetic organ for synthesizing that glucose for feeding themselves. So all lycophytes have what's called macrophylls, and macrophylls are leaves that are usually small and sometimes spine-shaped, and they're only supported by a single strand of vascular tissue. So here's a single strand of vascular tissue, small microphyll here, small microphyll here. An easy way to remember, micro means smaller, so these mean smaller leaves. And then while other vascular plants, other than Lycophytes, have megaphylls, which are leaves that are a lot larger. And the fact that there are larger leaves, they have more surface area for photosynthesis, and they're able to do more of that, which is better for the plants. And they also have a highly branched vascular system, not just one thing, but there's also all these other vasculature going through the bigger leaves. All right, and then Sporophyll was also something that was emergent amongst seedless vascular plants that non-vascular plants don't have. Sporophylls are actually modified leaves that bear sporangia. This doesn't have to be just a the top that has to have the spores. It can be underneath the leaves. So for ferns, sporophylls are actually clusters of sporangia called sori, and they're kind of located underneath the leaves like this in these little bumps. Every one of these yellow bump right there, it's a sori or sorus for singular, and they are filled with spores. For lycophytes and gymnosperms, their sporophylls form cone-like structure called the strobili, where they're just looking a little different in terms of where their spores are stored. For angiosperms, which is the flowering plants, their sporophylls are then called the carpel and the stamen. So most seedless vascular plants are what's called homosporous, where one type of sporophyll bears one type of sporangium, and they will produce one type of spores. There's no, forming male versus female. They will develop into actually a bisexual gametophyte that will produce both egg and sperm. They have the capacity to produce either gamete. Heterosporous then is the opposite of that, on the contrary, where plant species, all seed plants and few seedless plants are heterosporous, while seedless vascular plants are usually homosporous. So seed plants have, and a few seedless vascular plants have two types of sporophylls when they're heterosporous. One is called megasporophyll. Megasporophyll usually have megasporangia that will produce megaspore, eventually developing into your female gametophytes, which then will produce your eggs. Microsporophylls will have microsporangia that will produce microspores that will eventually develop into the male gametophytes and produce the sperm. So that's why heterosporous plants will have female gametophyte production and also male gametophyte development. Whereas homosporous spore production, you only have one type of spore, which means they have to be bisexual, being able to make egg and sperm within the same plant. All right, just as we have done the moss life cycle, let's go over the fern life cycle for vascular plants or seedless vascular plants. First, you have the sporangia, which releases the spore. Here's the sporangia, and then release the spore into the environment. Most fern species actually produce a single type of spores, so they are bisexual photosynthetic gametophytes, okay, or what we call the homosporous type of plants. Second step, each gametophyte right here then develops into a sperm-producing organs called the antheridium or antheridia, or the egg-producing archegonia, okay, or archegonium, depending if you're talking about singular or plural. So antheridia produce sperm, archegonia produces the egg. The sperm will again swim through thin film of water towards the egg in the archegonia, and it secretes, the archegonia actually secretes an attractant that directs the sperm as to where they're supposed to go. Fourth step is that once that sperm is able to get to the archegonia, fertilizes the egg inside of it, it will then become a zygote. The zygote then will become and develop into a new sporophyte, and this little young plant will grow out from the archegonia, okay, where you see that there you have this little leaf coming out. And then the last step is once these sporophyte becomes mature, underside these sporophytes leaves usually have with their reproductive leaves, they have spots called sori. Okay, sori for plural, sorus for singular, and where in each of these sorus there is cluster of sporangium, and you start the process all over again with sporangium releasing or forming those spores through meiosis, releasing the spore into the environment, etc., etc. And here is that fern life cycle animation.
Now let's see how the general plant life cycle is similar to the human life cycle. Cells in a diploid plant body undergo meiosis, resulting in haploid cells. Fertilization of a haploid egg cell by a haploid sperm cell results in a diploid zygote. The zygote undergoes mitosis and develops into a new diploid individual. But notice the gap between meiosis and production of gametes. This is where plant and animal life cycles differ. In plants, meiosis and structures called sporangia result in haploid cells known as spores. The diploid plant that produces spores is the sporophyte. A haploid spore undergoes many mitotic cell divisions and develops into a haploid multicellular individual. The sporophyte in this example is a fern, and the plant that develops from a fern spore is shown here. The new haploid multicellular plant is called the gametophyte because it produces gametes, egg and sperm cells. The gamete-producing structures are called gametangia. What process do you think occurs in the gametangia to produce egg and sperm cells? In the plant life cycle, unlike the human life cycle, gametes result from mitosis. This diagram summarizes the general plant life cycle.
Okay.
Plants are said to undergo an alternation of generations because the diploid sporophyte and haploid gametophyte are multicellular forms that occur alternately in the life cycle. Each form produces the other. All plants follow this same life cycle pattern, but each group of plants has certain variations.
Feel free to take
One
a screen
variation
capture
is
of
the
that.
relative size and longevity of the sporophyte and gametophyte. Notice that the fern sporophyte is much larger and longer lived than the gametophyte, which is about the size of the nail on your little finger. Another variation is whether the sporophyte and gametophyte live independently of each other. This is the case in ferns.
Okay, so if you would like that other cycle or alternation of generation diagram that was shown in the video close to the end, you can feel free to go rewind back to that or go back to that area and take a screenshot of that if you like that diagram. All right, and the last parts of this chapter then goes over the specific seedless vascular plant that we were talking about. First, though, being your Lycophytes, which is from the phylum Lycophyta. Lycophytes usually grow on tropical trees as epiphytes. Epiphytes just means that these are plants that use other plants as a substrate or kind of live and live on top of it or attaches to it, but is not a parasite. It will not infiltrate into the host plant and destroy the host plant. They kind of live in this happy relationship with each other, just using it as an anchorage, as a substrate to hang on to. And then the sporophytes of Lycophytes have upright stems with many small leaves. So this Lycophytes will include common plants such as club mosses, spike mosses, and quillworts. So this is club mosses right here. They look like little clubs sticking out. And then you have the quillworts right here, like a little fan. And then you have spike moss right here. And I think I've seen these moss actually sold at Home Depot, I think. I've seen something like that. If it's not spike moss, it's probably a related species. But for club mosses, they have the strobili, which are cone-like structures at the top, serving as sporophylls, and then they are actually homosporous. For spike mosses, they grow horizontally all over the ground like that. They don't grow upwards, and they are actually heterosporous, where they will form male and female gametophytes. And then you have quillworts, which is actually also heterosporous. And then the other phylum of seedless vascular plants is Monilophyta, or common name known as Monilophytes. And this particular phylum includes your ferns, horsetails, and whisk ferns, and its relatives. So this is a picture of the fern itself. This is a picture of the horsetail, and this one is the whisk fern. For ferns, they have megaphylls, large leaves, and they also have sporophytes that are horizontal stems that forms these fronds, or these large leaves you're seeing here. They're also homosporous, which means that sporangia, the homosporous meaning that they are bisexual gametophytes, where they have the capacity to make both sperm and egg. And then something interesting about the fern is that they have sporangia that can catapult several meters away from the parent fern, because they have this spring-like devices. That's something interesting. Horsetails are this one right here. They're homosporous as well, and they have these cone-like structures that release the spores. They're called arthrophytes because the stems have actually joints on them. That's why you see this little line here, little line here, and little line here. Those are the joints. That's why they call it the arthrophytes. And each stem actually serves as a main photosynthetic organ. So this is where I said there's exceptions where the leaves are not the main photosynthetic organ, because for horsetail, they are very tiny little leaves that can't do very much for photosynthesis. You need large surface area of green in order to do a lot of photosynthesis. So that's why the stem become the main photosynthetic organ for horsetails. And last but not least, you have the whisk ferns, which are sporophytes that have branching stem like this, but they have no roots. Okay, so that's different from the other seedless vascular plants we've talked about. And then the stems have scale-like outgrowth that lack vascular tissue, which is pretty interesting because we call this a vascular plant, but then yet it has outgrowth that lack vascular tissue. They say it's probably due to evolution. You can read about it in chapter 29. And then the leaves, the stems end in these yellow knobs here, where it have three fused sporangia within that yellow knob. And for whisk fern, they are classified as homosporous, which means they are bisexual gametophytes. And that's all I have for you for chapter 29. Let's go over the practice questions and then we'll be done. All right, which are the closest algal relatives of land plants? Chirophytes, that's what we said. They say plants are the closest relatives with green algae, specifically the chirophytes. The relationship between a gametophyte and a sporophyte and a liverwort is kind of like the relationship between who and who? A parent and a child, because they produce one is the parent, one actually produces the child. The parent produces a child that will produce the spores to become another plant itself. Okay. Plants that have vascular tissue are more versatile than non-vascular plants. So for example, flat vascular tissue enable plants to do what? Grow taller, because all the other ones, whether you're vascular or non-vascular, they all do that, the rest of them. The only thing that non-vascular plants can't do is grow tall. Which plants have a sporophyte that is nutritionally dependent on photosynthetic gametophytes? Dependent. Mosses, because that's one of the bryophytes. Bryophytes are the non-vascular plant that is where the sporophyte is nutritionally dependent and have to be attached to the gametophyte by a little footy, and that will help feed nutrients to the capsule. Okay, which of the following is a vascular plant? Not non-vascular, but vascular. Lycophytes, okay, because liverworts, mosses, hornworts, those are all bryophytes, which is the non-vascular plants. Which term is incorrectly defined? Megaspores, because they are not spores that develop into male gametophytes. They're actually spores that develop into female gametophytes, so it's not male. The rest of the three is actually correct. Sporophylls are modified leaves that bear sporangia. So rather than a little sporangia at the top, they have it under the leaves. Strobili are cone-like structures that form groups of sporophylls in lycophytes and gymnosperms. And then sori are clusters of sporangia produced by fern sporophylls underneath their leaves. So if you could travel in time machine to the period of Earth's history when plants began to appear, you would see which plant evolved after the liverworts. So this goes back to the phylogenetic tree we saw earlier that is proportional, where the branch length is proportional to time. So you would look where the liverworts are and then look at what's next, which should be mosses. What must you have to have spores? Sporangia, because it is sporangia that produces spores. And that's all I have for you for chapter 29.